different systems that we've got. We've got Microsoft Teams, Zoom. They work amazingly well, and they've liberated a lot of patients in particular, and made it much easier for them to contact their doctors and nurses. They've made it much easier for families to contact social workers. So that it's been fantastic, and I suspect far more people have benefited from this shift to the technology than have lost out. I think what we're specifically talking about is the provision of person-centered care, particularly for people living with frailty and dementia, and I think they have probably disproportionately lost out, just as they've lost out in many ways throughout COVID. So I suppose why not just do it the way we used to do it? And I think that's quite obvious. We can't be, we don't want those waiting rooms full of people sitting coughing on each other like they used to be. And I think if you look back to 6 months ago, or say last winter, the norm, which has always been the norm, has been for, say, GPs' waiting rooms to be full of people coughing on each other. And it's sort of crazy when you think we thought that was fine. The third bit down, which I'm just, to me, it's quite interesting, and I think that's to do with me as a doctor. I've worked as a doctor for over 20 years, and I've spent quite a long time learning how to communicate. I may not be communicating just now particularly well, but I try my best to communicate with patients and other colleagues. But I've had very little experience in communicating on teleconsultations. The quote's actually from my son, who asked the question when I told him I was doing this. He asked the question, "What's it on?" earlier today, and I just told him what it was on. I said it's on supporting people person-centered care consultations. I said, "What do you mean, what's it on?" And he actually meant, "What's it on? Which technology platform was it on?" And it was just interesting that in that little moment we completely misunderstood each other. And I think that this is just this layer upon layer of misunderstanding that goes on between the question I ask and what the patient understands, what the carer understands, and how that's translated and then fed back for us to try and work out. I think particularly in clinical care, it's very easy to make a clinical diagnosis. If a patient comes to you and they're coughing green stuff and they've got a temperature and they're not feeling well, it's quite easy to say they've got a chest infection. But providing the person-centered aspect of it, trying to work out what the patient, say, wants or doesn't want, that's a much more subtle and complex form of communication, which is much harder digitally. So, as I alluded to on the talk we just had, there's all sorts of problems to do with the remote consultations, and the numbers of different laptops and phones, headphones that I've encountered just in the past few months have been enormous. And yesterday I did a virtual ward round of it was over 20 residents in one of the care homes in Rotherham. And after doing a meeting with the nurse for several hours on Teams, and then meeting the patients on Teams, and then having an MDT, I literally had to lie down. It was so hard. But if you think it was really hard for me, it was probably as hard for the patients trying to make sense of what was going on to them. The signal strength. There's care homes that I go into virtually. The broadband doesn't reach, or the Wi-Fi doesn't reach to certain rooms. So people are just in you can't take the phone or the laptop because the signal cuts out. The screens always freeze in the middle, or they often freeze just as someone's about to tell you the punchline to a story or a joke. And that affects things. Patients, we know that what happens, particularly people who've got dementia in the latter stages, they go back to earlier days, they go back to their earlier experiences in life when they were younger. People who have dementia don't have experiences of this form of technology, just not part of their experience. So you're trying to engage with them, and I think maybe a lot of people can get their heads around face masks and infection control, because that's sort of been around in society. But holding up a little smartphone to someone's face and saying this is a doctor is completely alien, and I think that's what makes it all the more difficult. I think one of the important things is not to use technology if you don't have to. And very often, my experience anyway, just speaking to people on the phone is much better than trying to rig up a video consultation that can be difficult. There's a new phenomenon of, it's called round trip latency, which when you speak to someone on your normal phone, you've got high quality audio, but when you use WhatsApp or one of these other systems, the quality of the audio is reduced, and you end up getting people talking over each other, and that in turn affects what's being understood and when the question ends and when to all the natural pauses in conversation. There's the issue of our patients, if we're trying to engage them in their own homes who don't have smartphones. I work in Rotherham, and there's parts of Rotherham that don't have 4G. They struggle with 3G. So even if they have smartphones, unless they've got broadband, they can't do these consultations. I mentioned earlier that very, very often the relative takes over the conversation. That's about the conversation, the word around that I did. And again, I think part of this is we're just not evolved to work this way. It's a bit like me staring at the blank screen at the moment. I can't see anyone's faces. I can't see anyone's response, whether people are smiling, frowning, whether they have said something that's not understood or misunderstood or misconstrued. I can't feed back from that. And I think our brains just can't cope with it. And again, I think that impairs our interactions. As I said, this technology has helped. People don't have to travel all over the place. You can reduce or remove the risk of infection. But I think that more is needed, and particularly what we'll be finding is that the costs of high definition monitors and whatnot will come down, and it'll be much easier. But we know that there's big pressures on the care homes, and they're not necessarily going to splash out on the best quality. It's a bit like if you go back, well, even today, but certainly a few years ago, if you went to any care home in the UK, the quality of lighting was absolutely appalling, because people used to use the really low quality energy saving light bulbs, the sort of, I don't know, 30-watt light bulbs. So you'd go into someone's bedroom who couldn't see very well because they're 90. And when you're 90, you don't see as well. That's just a standard. And they'd have very poor lighting. As light bulb technologies change, the lighting levels come up in care homes. But I think we're in the same place with digital technology. People don't understand my accent a lot of the time. And I've not got that strong an accent, but it's lost. And in hospitals, what I usually do is I would get the nurse to translate what I'm saying to the local person. A lot of the carers, particularly in care homes and in social care in the UK, are born abroad. So they may be translating what they've heard off me, and they might not have quite caught it, and they might translate, or the person that they're talking to might not get their accent. And there's always all these tiers of problems that come into it. I've never been trained how to do this, so I don't know whether you look at the camera, whether I look at the screen, whether I look at the keyboard. I know when I'm talking to someone, I make eye contact in real life, but certainly just now, we don't know where to begin and how to do it, and what makes someone feel a bit easier and what makes someone feel better. During the start of COVID, and it's still going on, but particularly, people were forced to have conversations that were incredibly difficult, sensitive, emotive. Those nurses phoning up people that they'd never met before to talk about resuscitation status, to talk about advanced care planning, because we didn't have an alternative. And those are really, really difficult conversations for the nurses, for the GPs doing it as well, for the families. Is that going to change, or is that going to improve, or are we going to do that differently? I think, to me, that comes back to Julia's point about this little window of the summer that we've got. We should be working like crazy to get things sorted for the winter. We should be advanced care planning. We should be getting the technology sorted. We should be getting access rights sorted out. Instead, there's this sort of, I don't know, we're in this state of inertia. Right. So this is a poem which I mentioned at the start. We're going to send it round. It's not particularly relevant. It's relevant in terms of communication and the importance and just the subtle difference of saying the right word or the wrong word. You know, you might tell a patient you've not got cancer. It might be heard as you've got cancer and all the implications from that. And the potential for misunderstanding is so much greater using digital technology at the moment. That there's work to be done. So on that point, I'm gonna find where I click. I'm gonna stop screen sharing, right? And we're all back on. Hopefully there's some stuff to talk about. He said,
there's no questions in the chat box.
We've got some questions to start with. So I think what we could probably do is just start chatting and then see where we go. Does that sound good to everyone?
Yeah, and so the other thing.
Before I go on, so Sarah, who's on, I can see Sarah on my screen. So hello. Sarah, I had a conversation with Sarah before this, and Sarah's. Do you want to just explain sort of who you are and what you're going to be doing?
Yep, so I'm an academic at Leeds Beckett University. I'm a reader in dementia research, and we're currently doing some work looking at the implications of conducting remote consultations. So hopefully picking up on a lot of the issues that you've been talking about today, Rod. So we're really interested in the implications from the perspective of the person living with dementia that might be being assessed, but also from the perspective of the clinicians in terms of the challenges. And I guess one of the things, Rod, that you might not have mentioned so far, from a kind of person-centered perspective, I'm also interested in how we prepare people for these kinds of consultations. So from a kind of human rights perspective, is there something about how we can better prepare people and how equitable the services might be because of the movement to remote services? So really, I'm here just to kind of listen, and hear about people's experiences of this particular movement, but also think about what we can learn from person-centered care and apply to this situation. So I'm kind of ears and looking for feedback, really.
I think so. So one of the areas that I think we were talking about, Sarah, was, and what's happened. Anyone who's got a patient who's been referred to the memory service or is under the memory service at the moment, really anywhere in the UK, is that virtually all of those face-to-face assessments have stopped, and they've flipped to either phone call or in some cases video consultations. What I've seen, because I've read letters of those correspondence, I don't know if we've got any people working in memory services, but a lot of it's the conversations are had between the memory service and the relative. The patient is almost universally left out of the assessment. And I'm not blaming them, the memory service, for doing that. And to be honest, that's how I often work. When I go around the care homes, I rely on a lot of what the nurses told me about how the person's sleeping, eating, and part of that's the normal means of how you do it. But in normal world, I would spend time with that patient. I would get down on their eye level. I would look out for their physical and non-physical features, and that's just gone. It's just been completely parked.
And I think we know that triadic conversation was already inequitable in some ways, kind of pre-COVID. So now we're transitioning to this different kind of normal and remote consultations. I'm wondering what learning we can take from managing those kind of triadic conversations and not forgetting all of that and kind of throwing that out, because there are things that we know, aren't there, about how to manage conversations between a person when their family member is present and involve that person in conversations.
Yeah, I think a big part of it is that, a bit like I mentioned, so that it's almost as if there's two types of, well, there's many types, but there's two broad groups. So there's where video works with maybe a sort of young person who's coming with a quite specific disorder, who says to the GP, I've developed this rash, here, look at my rash. The GP looks at the rash, here, have this cream, that sort of transactional thing. And then there's the far more complicated ones that we're sort of talking about. The ones where it's the young person with a rash are actually probably far more efficiently dealt with on video. You can just rattle through those. I think the ones that we're talking about are actually probably half as efficient, and they probably take 2 or 3 times as long to do the same amount of consultation, but no one's given us that time. We haven't got that resource. So it's how you fit that in. And I don't know if anyone's got experienced that, but as well as the fact that it's completely knackering. It just completely exhausts you, because, you know, like me trying to see 20 patients in all those hours, I probably needed a couple of days to see them, but I was running through them in a session. So I almost certainly didn't give them the quality of sort of assessment that they warranted. I didn't get to spend the same time with them. And it was really, really, for me, it was fascinating, because I did this review yesterday, and one of the patients I saw had, I won't say the details, but he had a certain swelling somewhere, and the nurse described the swelling to me, and I asked the patient about the swelling, and had a look at the swelling, and I just couldn't tell from the swelling what the swelling was. So I went out and saw him today, and I hadn't been to the care home in months since COVID's come. And apart from the fact that it almost felt less familiar to be there in person, because I've been doing so much remotely, all of a sudden I walked into this room with this person that I'd only seen on camera, and within seconds the whole interaction was completely different. He was at ease, I was at ease, we were able to talk to each other. He had a much better understanding of what I was saying than I perceived he had from when I spoke to him on the video. I spent probably just as much time, if not less, going with him in person, but the quality of the interaction was much greater. Shall we? I'm going to go. Sorry, Colin.
I've got nothing in the chat box, Rod. I mean, I had a point that if I can do, because nobody else is putting any questions in, about communication, and it goes back to what you were saying about the quality of the remote assessment, because we've all done lots of training in the past, haven't we, around communication skills, which tells you that actually only something like 7% of communication is verbal, and you know the rest of it is made up of voice tone and body language. And if you can't get that on a virtual assessment, that's one of the big barriers that we need to get across in it. So we definitely need better bandwidth, you know, better quality sort of virtual conversations, and ones where you can't just see the head of the person. You need to be able to see, you know, how people are moving, and you know, it's things like that that are going to be, I mean, they're going to be the future, aren't we? And they're things that we're going to have to find a solution to.
But that's the point. I think that's the point, Colin, in that the audio, what I'm hearing, if I was to shut my eyes and listen, the audio is much, much poorer than if I was on the phone to you or seeing you in person. Yeah. So that's taken away. So yeah, I think it is, whether it is 7% or whatever the percentage is, it's certainly very small.
Yes.
I think the result is that we end up using different parts of our brain to sort of compensate. We sort of overwork our, you know, our eye ones, or our brains are really desperately trying to make sense of what's going on, trying to infer things from, and I think that sort of ties into the sort of exhaustion that goes on. I think a lot of people have talked about that during the whole sort of COVID scenario, is that we're maybe not working the same hours because we're not commuting, and we're not seeing maybe the same numbers of patients, but a lot of us are just completely exhausted because of pulling on different sort of parts of our brains. I've got
there's a few chats in the chat box now, Rod. Yeah, I think virtual is difficult most of the time. I agree. It's about seeing the person and being in the room with them. Bit of an elephant in the room, perhaps. Good Wi-Fi is expensive, especially in old thick-walled buildings, which is the case for many care homes. Additionally, COVID funding has been made available, but providers advise this is only just meeting the needs.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, the government gave out money to care homes, but it was only 1,000. You know, I think on average per care home, it was pretty small amount of money. And yeah, I agree. Lots of the care homes are in big old Victorian houses. How do we address that? I don't know if using the central heating Wi-Fi is a way around that. That's something to look at, or whether we trail wires, or, to be honest, do we start, as the incidence of COVID in the population drops, do we start saying, well, for care homes and for people who've got dementia and for older people, do we say, well, the damage to the clinical encounter is so great that we should be seeing people face to face? We should say, well, what you lose from not being able to, if we triage and you can do a lot of stuff, but ultimately to be able to sort of do it in a valuable way, you've got to say, we just can't do it. It just doesn't work at the moment with the technology we've got.
Yeah.
Can I turn that on its head a bit, Rod, and ask a question kind of out there to say, is there anyone that you think that this approach could work more effectively for?
Virtual consultations. I think it works. Well, again, when we're talking about there's sort of three groups. There's older people, there's people with frailty, and there's people with cognitive impairment. And I think what I found particularly and consistently is that the age of people is completely irrelevant, and that there's very old people who are completely happy and able to use the technology. A lot of it's to do with the actual technology they've got, whether they've got access to it. So I don't think age is an issue or a barrier. I've equally found loads of young people who can't seem to get their head around using iPads and phones and smartphones. I think a lot of that comes to the training, and over the past sort of 8 weeks, there's been a lot of emphasis on training particularly for care homes, not at all really for domiciliary care, but for care homes in supporting PPE and swabbing and things like that. But there's been no training that I can see sort of across the patch in terms of how to use an iPad to support communication between carer and their husband or wife.
Rod, can I just stop you and ask? We've got a hand up from Dorothy. Dorothy, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, it's just a comment, really. I work quite closely with care homes, and I think initially, before care homes had a COVID case, a positive person with COVID, they were desperate to keep everyone out, not just families, clinicians as well. But once they had COVID in their building, then they would welcome the GPs visiting, because a lot of them have struggled with as you said, with the virtual consultations, and have felt that they really do want that face-to-face interaction.
There seems to be quite a mix. I mean, what I've encountered is quite a mixture, in that I've had encounters with GPs who will just refuse to go out. They'll say, I'm not going out, and the care home saying, I want you to come out, and they're just stuck. And there's lots to it as to what the right thing to do and what the wrong thing to do is. I mean, there's lots of different levels of risk mitigation you can take. I mean, there's lots of stuff coming up, so we'll come to the topics. But this morning when I went out to the care home and I saw this man with the swelling, and I saw him and I saw a few other residents actually, and to be honest, I saw one resident who I just popped into to see how she was, because I was going to speak to her relatives later today, and I thought, well, I should see how she was, and I went in and she was really sick. So we actually sent her into hospital, and I wouldn't have seen her otherwise, and I completely missed that when I saw her yesterday on the video. So, but equally, I mean, my proposal was that, well, why don't I do the review remotely and then do a quick sweep and pop in and see a few people, because I've not seen anyone. I've literally completely, I've gone in maybe 2 or 3 times to care homes. All of it's been done with me, with the nurses. So let's see what else we've got here.
Let's see what, So we've got Diane. I feel that privacy in the person's home is an issue when other family members may be around. Because may not say what they would.
Well, I think Diane, that it's. I mean, it's. I don't know if there's anyone on who's had any phone. I mean, it's particularly with phone calls. What I've experienced when I phone up a patient who's got dementia, usually I would see those people face to face, and it's good. Like I said, normally I'd have the conversation with both them and their husband or wife, knowing that the person who's got dementia may not take everything in, but also accepting that their husband or wife will, but you involve the person, and you can pick up on their non-verbals and what upsets them and what. But what my experience is either you've got the person with dementia and you have that conversation and then they hang up the phone and you don't know if they've taken anything in, or they hand it over so they're completely disempowered, or you say, "Can I speak to your husband?" And well, why do you want to speak to my husband? So I think that's a really valid point. And the other thing is you have phone conversations, and if it's on a mobile, people kind of have them on speaker, so you don't really know who's on the room. Yeah. Personally, just take it, and I leave it down to the person I'm speaking to if they want other people to listen.
Yeah. Okay, we've got Rani who's saying, how can we upskill care home staff to support virtual consultations? How can nursing home clinical staff help with consultation?
Well, Rani, I think that, well, I don't think, sorry to be just blethering away here, but if anyone wants to butt in, please just put your hand up. What we've done in Rotherham and what's happened, well, this is in South Yorkshire, this is in Doncaster has done it, and Sheffield have been doing it, and they've been using, ironically, they've been using digital technology to do the training. So in Sheffield and Doncaster, they've been using something called Echo, which is an online digital platform using Zoom. In Rotherham, we just went and did it ourselves using Zoom. We're hoping to do it using Echo, and it's basically doing video consultation, video conferencing with care home staff. So before the government mandated that we should do it in Rotherham, we set up our own training package for care homes on PPE and infection control. So I think we need to make that available to the care homes. I think the difficult part of it's going to be people purchasing. The hardware is probably less of an issue because a few £100 initial outlay for an iPad is probably not dramatic, but it's the ongoing costs of maybe broadband or having to do major technological environmental things to people's houses to enable that. I don't know if anyone's, Rani, have you got any experiences of?
No, the reason I raised this is prior to joining the CCG, I used to work in Lincolnshire County Council, and I used to work with failing care homes. And certainly the issues that we had was broadband in rural areas is quite poor. So the connectivity in rural areas can be a challenge. And certainly now we cover East Riding, which will have the same challenges as Lincolnshire. But the other bit was, how do we use the clinical staff that are already in that setting? And there was a real disconnect between clinicians and clinicians in care homes. So I was working quite closely with staff in nursing homes to look at how we upskilled those nurses, because a lot of the time they have become de-skilled. So they do need a lot of training and support. So I was just wondering what your experience was around that.
Well, I think that's across the board, and I don't want to get political on this, but there was the thing that the Prime Minister said knocking care homes a week or two ago. And we know that it's because there's been so little investment in social care and so much disinvestment in social care over the past 10 years. And a lot of that's gone out of training and development, and it's been stripped away. And also because there's such a high turnover of staff in social care and all those different aspects, that we've started with a workforce who've not been provided the training. I've met very few people in my life who don't want to be trained. If people provided the resource and the time to do it, people are happy because it makes their job more enjoyable and more satisfying. But it's not been an option. I think the using Zoom or any other form of, like we're doing just now, to provide the training, because it doesn't cost anything additional, is a really important way to do it. There's things you can't provide. You can't communicate. It's very difficult to teach certain skills this way. And And a bit like the conversation we're having, I think if all of us, I don't know how many there is 12 or something of us were in a room, we'd probably be having a very different conversation about this communication than we're having now. My experience is it'd probably be a more generative conversation, and there'd probably be a bit more humour and a bit more interaction. But we haven't got that, and I don't think that's going to happen for the foreseeable future. So I suppose part of it for me, and particularly in relation to, say, CCGs, is getting the CCGs or the other commissioning bodies to realise how important this is, and that for people to realise really how poor the clinical consultations that I've provided are, because we're working with our, in such environments. It's a bit like working it's a bit like trying to assess a rash when all you're being provided is a really low level of lighting. You can't, and you're going to make mistakes. And I'm sure there's been a heck of a lot of mistakes and mismanagement. And I think I've seen that coming through in the media as well, where people have died in care homes because the assessments that have been made, very often by doctors, have not been right, and decisions have been made to maybe not transfer someone to hospital when it might have been right, because they've either been overestimated, people think they're too sick to survive, or people think they're not sick enough to send to hospital. And I think that's probably a direct result of all of this. So I don't sense there's any more money going to go into training in health and social care, but I think it's upon us to really do it. And I think that's what we've done in Rotherham. We got someone from the CCG, someone from the Acute and Community Trust, and me and a couple of other people together, and we just set up our own educational program and did it. It just took cost some time, and it was really well received.
Thank you for that. Would it be possible to maybe send us some information around that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, please just email. And we've got, I mean, what we've done, and again, I find it a bit frustrating, because when the government then told us we had to do it, we had to sort of include their stuff. So we sort of lost a bit of the dynamic, the interaction. But I think as we tick the box for PPE, we can actually then move on to teaching and training and things that might be a bit more relevant once the essentials. I mean, certainly what I've seen as well is that since the PPE trainings come in, PPE and infection control practices in care homes have dramatically improved. When I dial in or when I visit infrequently, people are complying, and behaviour change doesn't happen overnight. So, should we move on?
Yeah, we've got about 2 minutes left.
Thank you.
So
Thanks.
I know Kulvant put something in a comment about community settings. We're also mindful of digital poverty.
Yeah. And I don't know how to answer that, and I think that's, I mean, I had, well, to be honest, Kovan, I had an answer. I had an answer for Rotherham. I thought I called them the flying squad, and I wanted us to have a team of people who would go out to people's houses with tablets. It doesn't work if you're in a rural setting with no 4G. But I mean, you can do video consultations with people on the moon and in the North Pole. So I'm sure we can do it in rural Rotherham, So I had the answer. We divert some of the resources that we're using for other things and have people jump on a motorbike and drive to that person's house. That might be an easier way of doing it. It hasn't really gone down that well. It's sort of been sucked into that. Well, we're sort of, the energy's gone out of COVID, or the pressure's gone out of COVID. Were you going to say something, Sarah?
I was just going to say, I don't have an answer again, but it's a really important point, isn't it? And it's important about kind of where we know health inequalities exist as well. It's important that this doesn't kind of exacerbate those health inequalities, which is very relevant to the conversation we've been having today. And I think while sometimes this can provide an answer to some groups of people, obviously it might actually exacerbate an issue which we need to be really mindful of, and then monitor that and make sure that we are monitoring and feeding back where people aren't using services and where people are falling through the net, so that we can make a case to address those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't realise the time had passed so quickly. We've got Dorothy. I hadn't realised that in East Riding you were doing echo, so that's really good to hear. I mean, I think we probably need to just do a bit of because this chats across the whole of Yorkshire and Humber, so it'd be interesting to hear what is going on in different areas, and maybe to talk about that later, or we could, from a network perspective, do a bit of information gathering, because there's no reason why these platforms can't go out to several hundred people. It loses that intimacy, obviously, but a little bit of training is probably better than no training. Dorothy, just put your hand up.
Yeah, just to say that actually the training's been really well received, because it's by people who the care homes then contact when they have an infection. So they've already seen that person doing the PPE donning and doffing. Yeah. And in some ways it becomes more intimate, actually. It can be more meaningful.
Well, we one of our care home liaison nurses, Lynn, did the training. So she goes out and she's got a really close relationship with the care homes, and it's been interesting for me, because since I've done some of the training, I've then spoken to people in the care homes, and so I'm the guy from the video, and and it sort of it improves that sort of relationship. So
we better stop there, Rod, and go back to the main room, just in case people don't know how to get back to the main room. I've put the link in the chat box there.
Or you can just go back to the room. I'll
stick around in this room for a few seconds if you guys want to go, and I'll just make sure that nobody's got problems getting back in.
I'll see you there, Colin.
So we'll see you back in the main room. Yes, thank you, everyone.